Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team, Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you again to the 92nd lecture of the lecture series on this platform. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of the academic study of Indian languages and literature envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department was established which continues to carry on with the research in Indian languages. And with students of this university, and therefore we took inspiration from this history. And it is a platform initially for sharing research interest and ideas. We are for last 1 year we are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. And I am really happy that today we have with us Professor Radha Chakravarty ma'am, and she will be talking on Mahasweta Devi. And before handing over the stage to the ma'am, I would like to briefly introduce Professor Radha Chakravarty. Professor Radha Chakravarty is a writer, critic, and translator, and she is also professor of comparative literature and translation studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She has co-edited the Essential Figure, which is from Harvard and Vishwavarti, nominated for the Book of the Year 2011 by Martha Nussbaum for the New Statesman. Her recent book, Shades of Difference, Selected Writings of Rabindranath Tagore, published from Social Science Press 2015, is an edited volume. And her book, Feminism and Contemporary Women Writers, is a comparative study of fiction by Mahasweta Devi, Anita Desai, Doris Lessing, Toni Morrison, and Margaret Atwood, and Buchi Insekta. She is the author of novelist paper Gender and Modernity in Selected Text, Routledge 2013. She has also translated several of Telugu's works, including Gora, Boyhood Days, Choker Valley, Farewell Song, etc. etc. And now currently, ma'am is working on Mahasweta Devi and translating extensively Mahasweta Devi, which is already I mean will discuss today, probably in our lecture. So I won't take much time without further ado. I hand over formally this platform to Arthika to coordinate this session and carry forward this session. Thank you. Arthika, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Pratim, and welcome, ma'am, to our 92nd session.
Thank
And
you.
so, our speaker, Professor Radha Chakravarty, she is a writer, critic, and translator. She is a professor of comparative literature and translation studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She has co-edited the Essential Tagore that was published from Harvard and Vishwavarti that was nominated the Book of the Year in 2011 by Martha Nussbaum for the New Statesman. Ma'am's recent book, Shades of Difference Selected Writings of Rabindranath Tagore, has been published in 2015 from Social Science Press, and it's an edited volume with a DVD containing audiovisual material. Her book, Feminism and Contemporary Women Writers, that was published in 2008, is a comparative study of fiction by Mahasweta Devi, Anita Desai, and Doris Lessing. And we'll also learn more about Mahasweta Devi in today's session. And she is the author of novelist Tagore, Gender and Modernity in Selected Texts. She has also translated several of Tagore's works like Gora, Boyhood Days, Choker Bali, Farewell Song, Sheshar Kobita, and The Land of Cards, Stories, Poems, and Plays for Children. Other works in translation include Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Kopal Kundola, In the Name of the Mother by Mahasweta Devi, and Crossing Stories from Bangladesh and India. Ma'am has also edited Body Maps, Stories by South Asian Women, and she has co-edited Tagore the Eternal Seeker, Footprints of a World Traveler, and Writing Feminism, South Asian Voices, and once again Writing Freedom, South Asian Voices. Her poems have appeared in Journal of the Poetry Society of India, Contemporary Major Indian Women Poets, The Poet, Day 5 we review the Skinny Poetry Journal, Indian Poetry, and many more. Her translation of Mahasweta Devi's memoirs, Our Shanti Niketan, is a forthcoming book from Seagull Books. Her essays and review articles have appeared in books and periodicals worldwide. Thank you once again, ma'am, for joining us today. I won't take much of our time, and I would like ma'am to start the lecture. And this virtual floor is all yours, ma'am. You may please begin your lecture.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by saying how pleased I am and how grateful I am to your group, the Calcutta Comparatists, for asking me here to speak to you today. I love speaking to young people, and you've given me a place to speak about one of my favorite subjects. So I look forward to my interaction with all of you. Thank you for your interest in my work. And today I'll be speaking about Mahasweta Devi, and I've called my lecture Visions of Transformation, Remembering Mahasweta Devi. It appears easy to label Mahasweta Devi. Thanks to the image created by Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak, largely sustained by Mahasweta herself, we readily think of her as the firebrand of Bengali literature. The writer and activist who championed the rights of the oppressed, especially the indigenous people and landless peasants of eastern and central India. The label is not false, but perhaps we need to look beyond the stereotype to seek out the other hidden dimensions of Mahasweta's life, work, and personality, to recognize their complexity. Now, 5 years after her passing, it remains important to remember Mahasweta, but it is also time for a radical reappraisal of her significance for the world we live in today. Mahasweta was a prolific writer. She wrote more than 100 works of fiction, along with plays, essays, memoirs, children's literature, journalistic writings, and newspaper reports. She edited the journal Bortika and translated several books from English to Bengali, including A.K. Ramanujan's work on Indian folklore. Although she wrote primarily in Bengali, she did not write only for Bengal. Through the efforts of scholars and translators, she came to be known as a writer with a pan Indian appeal. Later, via the interventions of critics like Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak, she also acquired international stature and repute. The narrative of her emergence as a world literary figure is now well known. Also familiar is the story of her political volte-face during the Singur and Nondigram protests, a shift of loyalty that alienated many of her former friends and allies. What we often miss when attending to these narratives is their crucial but concealed subtext. The Mahasweta, who strove and generally succeeded in presenting a coherent face to the world, insisting that all the diverse elements of her life and activity were inseparably united, was actually a divided self. She led public campaigns for human rights, but battled her private demons alone. Beyond all the easy critical catchphrases about her crusade for the claims of the downtrodden, her works raise complex and troubling questions that compel us to look beyond her own claims about her own work and also beyond what most critics say about her. In her own observations about her work, Mahasweta projects herself in the role of activist for the upliftment of the marginalized. She speaks of, and I'm quoting, a tremendous, excruciating, explosive love that can still dedicate us to this work. Along with the luminous anger, another of her phrases, along with the luminous anger against the oppressors of the common people, her writings are indeed driven by this explosive love, which counters political and social violence with a unique brand of textual violence. In her own words, a white hot anger impels her to write, and her writing is inseparable from her activism, since both are aspects of the same endeavor. In her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak argues that there are degrees of subalternity, hierarchies even among the oppressed, with the disenfranchised woman often placed at the bottom of this structure of exclusions. For instance, the tribal woman is thrice oppressed for her ethnicity, class position, and gender. It is this ultimate level of subalternity that draws Devi's particular attention. Hence, there is a degree of truth in the perception of Devi as the voice of the silenced subaltern. In this lecture, though, I argue that this perception is true only up to a point. I unpack the partial truths that underlie this stereotypical image of Mahasweta Devi to argue that her representations of the subaltern bring together the aesthetic and political in ways that demand a more nuanced reading, premised on the recognition that her creative writings need to be read as literature rather than as forms of social documentation or witnessing. Drawing on selected texts, I examine her representations of the subaltern to tease out also some pressing questions about the politics of representation in a world dominated by hierarchical power structures and prescriptive forms of canonicity. Read through this lens, Mahasweta Devi's writings emerge as ambivalent texts, simultaneously imbued with radical potential and a continued reliance on certain traditional forms of signification. This interrogation of the stereotype opens up the possibility of rereading Mahasweta Devi's stories in newer and more unsettling ways. Mahasweta Devi criticizes the writers of her time for their apolitical stance and apathy towards social wrongs. We find this, for instance, in her preface to Boshai Tulu. She distances herself from the mainstream literary tradition, blazing a trail of political commitment. Critics such as Nirmal Ghosh read her works in relation to the class struggle, in keeping with Devi's own assertion that she writes about class, not gender. Other readers, however, such as Bharati Bandyopadhyay, Maitreyi Chattopadhyay, and Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak, argue that women's oppression forms a core concern in Devi's writings. But unlike most Bengali women writers of her time, such as Ashapurna Devi, Jyotirmoy Devi, Leela Majumdar, and Pratibha Basu, she situates her female characters not in the cocooned world of middle class domesticity, but within larger frameworks of social, economic, and political exploitation. The dominant stereotype, though, remains that of Mahasweta Devi as the champion of the marginalized tribes, the indigenous people of India. All these labels draw upon the idea of the subaltern, the marginalized and silenced minorities who bear the yoke of oppression without being given a voice. Hence, the role of Mahasweta Devi in representing these unheard voices tends to be singled out as her distinctive achievement as a writer activist. Representation, as we know, can imply two things: aesthetic portrayal or political intervention. In the popular perception of Mahasweta Devi, the latter meaning tends to prevail, casting her in the role of the writer who raises her voice on behalf of the oppressed. Contrary to this widely held view, I argue that in Devi's fiction, we see both kinds of representation at work. The aesthetic and the political senses of representation come together, but not always in ways that dovetail easily. In fact, there is often a tension between these two elements that adds layers of complexity to her stories, signaling the inadequacy of the simplistic stereotype. Read in this way, Mahasweta Devi's stories emerge as multi-voice discourse where different and often contradictory elements operate in a dialogic relationship with each other. In this respect, her stories differ from her activist writings despite a shared political and ethical framework. When read closely, Devi's stories reveal a literary quality that complicates the received impression that they are instances of realistic social documentation. There is a sophistication in the formal and stylistic features of her writing that signals her use of intellectual and aesthetic elements that separate her own discourse from that of the ordinary people she writes about. Her early life and education as a member of a culturally distinguished family, her bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature, her English monograph on Tara Shankar Bandyopadhyay, and her travels across India and the rest of the world indicate her access to multiple literary and cultural traditions and to a life of intellectual privilege. This cultural capital and awareness of literary traditions add facets to her creative writing that distinguish her from her subaltern fictional characters and mark out the position of social privilege from where she writes. Devi's writings are often read as forms of witnessing or social documentation, as I said. But how empowering can such attempts at representation be for those denied the right to represent themselves? Is this appropriation of voice another instance of continued silencing of those on the margins? Can the experience of oppression be authentically described by those who have not been subjected to it? Such questions are bound to arise. We may respond, in Mahasweta's defense, of course, that her fiction offers us many figures of resistance, subalterns who can and do speak, such as Draupadi, Bashai Tudu, and Mary Orao. Or we may argue that Bortika, the journal Mahasweta edited, was a forum where the underprivileged could express themselves. But we cannot avoid confronting these questions about rights, authenticity, and representation. Likewise, questions about class struggle are not as simple as they seem. As an avowed Marxist, Mahasweta insists that she is opposed to class hierarchies, but her writings reveal her own position of intellectual privilege. The narrative voice in most of her fiction is far more sophisticated than the voices of the protagonists who come from the social margins. The voice can be, by turns, urbane, savagely ironic, elusively erudite, or scathingly critical, but it is never naive. It is not possible, after all, for a writer, even if she is Mahasweta Devi, to completely escape the social context that has shaped her language and worldview. Hence, the social gap between her own class position and that of the people she writes about can only be partially bridged. This is not a weakness in her writing. It is one of the features that lends it density of social and linguistic texture. The drama of class difference thus plays out at more than one level in her texts. In class antagonisms among the fictional characters in the story, but also in the social and intellectual disparity between the author herself and many of her own characters. Nor is class difference Mahasweta's sole concern, though she brands herself a staunch Marxist. When I asked her about her interest in gender issues, she told me categorically, and I'm quoting from the interview, "When I write, I never think about gender. I never think about women. I look at the characters and I look at their lives, as I have argued elsewhere in my work. Her writings are replete with evidence of her awareness of the plight of women in a patriarchal society. Not just the iconic stories Draupadi and Stanodayini, but innumerable other instances from her oeuvre indicate her concern with intersecting axes of oppression, of which gender is a prime constituent. Institutions such as motherhood come in for scathing scrutiny in some of her narratives. Jomunavati's mother, Sindhu Bala, and Ma from Dawn to Dusk. And all these are stories I've translated in the collection called In the Name of the Mother, published by Seagull. These stories are just a few examples. The body, reproductivity, and prostitution are other gender related issues that surface in her work. The women in her fiction are not always victims. Some of them, such as the Rani of Jhansi, Draupadi, and Mary Ram, are powerful figures. In the story Giribala, which also I've translated, we encounter the issues of child marriage and trafficking. We see how the patriarchal ideology instills itself in the minds of the vulnerable in the guise of proverbial wisdom. We recognize this process of interpellation in the wry fatalism of the saying that recurs like a refrain throughout the story Giribala, and I quote the refrain: "A girl's by fate discarded, lost if she's dead, lost if she's wed." Yet, the story charts the subaltern protagonist's journey towards a position where she can claim her subjectivity and agency. After multiple pregnancies, she chooses to undergo sterilization, much to the outrage of her husband. And after losing her daughters to the flesh trade, she shocks the community by walking out on her husband Aulchan, who has connived in these transactions. According to Mary Louisa Capelli, and I quote, by taking control of her body, Giribala directly subverts her husband's domination over her reproductive organs and contests the transformation of her daughters into surplus labor to feed male sexual appetites. Unquote. The narrative of Stanodayini presents a sharp critique of the commodification of motherhood. To sustain her work as a foster mother, Joshoda has to produce a constant supply of milk by continuing to produce children of her own. The traditional nature culture divide thus gets confounded, as biological motherhood gets exploited by the economics of foster motherhood. Drawing attention to this irony, the text refers to popular tropes, such as the nationalist image of Mother India, religious deities such as the lion seated, and mythical mothers such as Lord Krishna's foster mother Joshoda, to critique the dark social realities masked by the idealization of motherhood in dominant discourses. Traditionally, the mother is the repository of values such as love, care, and nurture. But Joshoda's role as wet nurse, or rather the logic of economic exchange involved in this, force her to deny these affective aspects of mothering her own children and also to her milk sons, explaining their subsequent lack of gratitude towards her. In a complex double move, the narrative critiques the traditional ideology of motherhood while implicitly valorizing uh, the notions of love, care, and nurture traditionally associated with motherhood. At the end of the story, while recognizing that Joshoda's naive identification with her mythical counterpart signals her lack of awareness about the implications of her predicament, because she deludes herself that she is the mythical Joshoda reborn. Uh, but the reader still feels compelled to share some of her outrage at the treatment meted out to her. In this shared outrage, we find the ethical charge of Devi's vision. The multi voice text simultaneously deconstructs the myth of sacred motherhood, even while activating the same myth to make a sharp comment on the inhumanity of a society shorn of humane values. Clearly, Mahasweta's writings offer a more complex texture than what her statements would indicate. Take her critique of ideas of the nation, for instance. As a Marxist, she is expected to place class above nation as a category of social organization. Her writings do constitute a strong argument against some kinds of nationalist discourse, pointing up the hollowness of the idea of an independent India when so many of the land's denizens are denied freedom. Yet she does not abjure the idea of nationhood entirely. Instead, she sometimes speaks of an alternative India, where ordinary people are the makers of history. She claims to represent, and I quote, the general tribal as Indian. Not only that, they are Indians who belong to the rest of India, and she says this in one of her interviews with Gayatri Spivak. For her, The Rani of Jhansi represents an icon signifying the spirit of the people at a key moment in the history of an emerging nation. And I quote from Mahasweta, Rani Lakshmi Bai was an expression of what India felt in those times, of the first conscious rebellion taking place against the stranglehold of foreign rule. In such instances, the idea of the nation is not discarded but reimagined. The primacy of class in Marxism is here complicated by the inclusion of nation as another marker of identity. Things, therefore, don't dovetail neatly when we try to categorize Mahasweta as a writer. The ruptures between the discourses that drive her work become even more pronounced when we consider her use of language. She writes in Bangla, but in many of her works, the main narrative includes heteroglossia in the form of different social registers of language use and also multilingualism in the form of other languages interspersed with the Bengali. In Draupadi, for instance, we find both chaste and colloquial Bengali, but also tribal language, the non-verbal language of ululation, and many expressions in italicized English. Even the English is fractured because, along with idiomatic usage, we also have localized adaptations such as the powerful word counter. Here, instead of invoking a linguistically and socially harmonious nation, multilinguality becomes a marker of and a commentary on the fractured and hierarchical nature of our society. Draupadi is widely cited as a story where the subaltern speaks effectively. It is regarded as a supreme example of Mahasweta Devi's achievement in representing the subaltern. However, there remains a distinction between writing for the subaltern and speaking as the subaltern. That is the aspect of the narrative I wish to draw special attention to, for it again demonstrates the operation of a multi voice discourse within the text. As already asserted earlier, Mahasweta Devi, with her background of social and intellectual privilege, can be identified, cannot be identified as a subaltern, nor can her empathy for the downtrodden completely erase the social and cultural distance that separates her from the subaltern subjects she writes about. What we find in the text of Draupadi, rather, are multiple languages, registers, styles, and vocabularies jostling each other in a fractured, disruptive fashion, in a way that makes the differences between them stridently visible. Draupadi's song, in her tribal language, is unintelligible to the Bengali Bhadralok and left untranslated both in the Bengali text and in Spivak's English translation. Her ululation, a warning signal, signifies a mode of communication that is prelingual. The word counter is a local appropriation of the English word encounter, giving its meaning a different twist. These elements work as linguistic markers of social, cultural, and political distance. The simplicity of the tribals and villagers' lack of sophistication are signaled by the use of such forms of heteroglossia. But set off from the voices of the characters is the narrative voice that frames this text. This voice, indeed, is far from naive. In the voice of the narrator, we hear, for instance, references to Shakespeare's Prospero, Antonioni's highbrow cinema, and to the male principle in Sankhya philosophy. Scattered through the entire narrative are numerous English words and phrases. Such stylistic strategies are not merely markers of heterogeneity, they also sometimes function as modes of textual resistance, more sophisticated and of an intellectual order far removed from the embodied mode of resistance adopted by Dopti, the fictional character. We encounter such sophistication in ironic allusions to the law of confrontation by which fugitives are shot at the taxpayer's expense, and the Indian constitution where all human beings, regardless of caste or creed, are sacred. This rhetorical sophistication in the multi voice text indicates Devi's ambivalence about class, for she uses the linguistic tools of cultural privilege to attack the idea of cultural privilege. This is not to dismiss her critique of class oppression, but to insist on a more nuanced understanding of how class actually uh, operates in the text. Equally fractured is the vision of history that emerges from Mahasweta's writings. To the official discourse of history, from which landless peasants, tribals, and many women are excluded, she offers a counter discourse. She says, I have always tried to explore people's version of history. In all my writings, I have tried to present the subaltern point of view. She also declares, for me, the real history remains in the space between two printed lines, the white space, because there one has to search for people's history. In place of formal historiography, she often takes recourse to gossip, rumor, and local lore. Years ago, she tells us, when I was a child, my grandmother told me the story of the Queen of Jhansi. Heard in her gentle voice by the dim light of a lantern, it did indeed seem like the most amazing fairy tale. When researching the life of the Rani, Mahasweta would tap into local lore, such as in the lines "Patthar mitti se fauj banaye, काठ से कटवार, पहाड़ उठाकर घोड़ा बनाई, चली ग्वालियर." The act of storytelling, learned from her foremothers, becomes for Mahasweta an interventionist emancipatory practice. In the process, the idea of truth no longer remains tied to conventional notions of factual history. To me, she once said, and I quote from the interview, my approach is forensic. I always look beyond the surface to search for what lies behind. While this probing of appearances to expose hidden realities is indeed Mahasweta's forte, her writings often accomplish this by blurring the difference between history and myth, generating a spectacular juxtaposition of dystopian fact and visionary imaginings. In a representation of the tribal community, for instance, there is a strong romantic element, and we often feel that there is a kind of myth making at work. This tension between dystopian and utopian elements makes for a dynamic scene of writing. Their rootedness in cultural particularities, the local histories in which Mahasweta's narratives are embedded, make it difficult to imagine easy transitions from local to national and thence to international frames of reading. That has indeed been the trajectory of her reception. But in retracing that trajectory, it is crucial to pay attention to the changes and ruptures that have accompanied these epistemic shifts. And I'm speaking here briefly about the multiple forms of reception that her work has received. To the Bengali literary establishment, Mahasweta Devi was something of a thorn in the flesh. She flouted literary and linguistic conventions, broke social barriers, explored subaltern worlds beyond the Bhadralok Bengali sphere, and used her pen as a weapon. Yet she became a force to contend with because of her extraordinary talent, radical vision, and worldwide fame. Mahasweta is also known across India through translations, adaptations, critical discourses, and her reputation as an activist. She has been compared with writers such as Manto, Premchand, and Jhumpa Lahiri. Mulk Raj Anand, Shujit Mukherjee, G.N. Devi, Shiv Vishwanathan, Anjum Katyal, Tutul Mukherjee, E. Satyanarayanan, M. Asaduddin, Jay Dev, Nivedita Sen, Shaurin Bhattacharya, Sanatan Bhowal, and Nandini Sen are among the many writers and critics who address her work. Her writings have been translated into many Indian languages, including Hindi, Assamese, Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Marathi, Oriya, Gujarati, and Ho, and also into English. Mahasweta entered the stage of world literature through the mediation of Gayatri Chakravarty's Vivek. She has been translated into English, French, German, Italian, and Swedish, and has also won numerous international awards. Judith Butler, Martha Nussbaum, Gabriella Collu, Jennifer Wenzel, Mary Louise Acapelli, Minoli Sirgado, Diniti Karunanaike, Sun Lee Yuk, and Henry Schwartz are among the international critics who acknowledge her importance. Her work has drawn comparisons with Buchi Emicheta, Asia Jabbar, and Grimm's fairy tales. Judith Butler, in Undoing Gender, argues that, and I quote, the tribal South Asian writing of Devi cannot simply be called tribal or made to represent the tribal because in this writing there is also a vision of internationality at stake. Unquote. The narrative of development connects the local to the global, as traditional means of labor are effaced and exploited by developers who are connected to systems of global capital. Butler draws attention to this link between the local and global, and the mediation of Spivak as translator as factors that complicate the idea of the tribal as subaltern in Devi's work. What changes when locally rooted narratives migrate to other places through translation, which is what has happened to Mahasweta Devi? What can a story like Draupadi, translated into English by Spivak, mean to readers in the Anglo American world, for instance? Certainly, many local details get erased or flattened out in the process of transmission across continents. Spivak's eminent role as the mediator between Mahasweta and the West. She has been described as Mahasweta's Dwarpalika by Shujit Mukherjee. Her role also raises questions about authorship, authority, and the translator's freedom. The culture specific aspects of the text can impel an interrogation of the universalist assumption of some forms of international feminisms. This has been Spivak's self proclaimed mission. But translation is not merely a linguistic transfer. To translate a writer like Mahasweta Devi is a political act. To bring her texts to a larger world and place them in the arena of world literature is to challenge certain dominant paradigms that prevail in the literary universe today. Despite the impossibility of attaining exact fidelity to the original, translation remains a valuable way to undertake cultural border crossings that can promote greater awareness of heterogeneities and trigger a questioning of literary conventions that have much to do with global power relations. Such translations can inspire new ways of interpreting Devi's works, a process described by Brinda Bose as transformed transmission. For instance, Devi's stories about the tribal communities of India invite comparison with the struggles of indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, such as the Native Americans or the Aborigines in Australia. At the borderlines between cultures, translation can raise questions of location, difference, inclusivity, heterogeneity, and authority. Like storytelling, translation too is never innocent. Like writing and reading, translation too can raise unsettling questions, revealing its interventionist possibilities. Mahasweta insists on the historical basis for her creative writings. But in her fiction, social realism is offset by a visionary quality that enables the imagining of transformative possibilities. The right to dream is what allows mankind to survive, she declares. Her stories focus on subaltern subjects, but not all of them are shown to be radical in their sensibility. Often, the ethical charge in Devi's writing lies not only in characterization, but also in other textual elements such as irony, parody, the use of different linguistic registers, as we saw with Draupadi, and intertextuality. Factual reality jostles with myth, legend, literary allusions, and a visionary imagination to present us in her representations of the subaltern with a corpus of writing that speaks to us in many voices. Rather than striving for a seamless texture, Devi's writing deliberately courts a dynamic quality of disruptiveness and dissonance, as a way of foregrounding the irreducibility of difference and jolting the reader out of apathy or complacency. For the real target of Devi's transformative rhetoric is not the fictional character, but the reader who is implicitly ascribed a position of ethical responsibility. And beyond the public scene of writing and critical reception, there remains hidden from view the private Mahasweta, the lonely personality who I often suspect used her tireless zeal for activism, public advocacy, and profile writing to camouflage the inner drama of her private life. In her autobiographical writings, which I have translated, these writings, sometimes shadowed by a failing memory, here Mahasweta Devi offers lively vignettes of childhood experiences, family life, her education, and early love for reading, reactions to events in the outside world, and her concerns for social and political issues. Our Shantiniketan, memoirs of her early school days in Shantiniketan in the living presence of Rabindranath Tagore, is shot through with a wry, often poignant awareness of her failing memory at an advanced age. Seen through the innocent eyes of a young girl, a forgotten Shantiniketan comes to life. The place, its people, flora and fauna, educational environment, culture of free creative expression, vision of harmonious coexistence between natural and human worlds, and above all, the towering presence of Tagore himself. Alongside, we get a glimpse of the private Mahasweta, her inner life, family and associates, and the early experiences that shaped her personality. The book is dedicated to her son Nobarun, fondly addressed as Bappa, from whom she became estranged when she left her first husband, Bijan Bhattacharya. Both of us lost our childhood at the age of 13. Now I'm walking backwards towards your childhood. On the way, I gift you the most carefree days of my own childhood. Let my childhood remain with you, she says in the dedication. In her letters and conversations, we learn about the hidden challenges of Mahasweta's fearless struggles against the oppressive forces in the public domain. We also glimpse the darker side of her personal past, including broken relationships, her anguish at parting from her son, Nabaru, her lifelong loneliness, and her attempt to take her own life. In a conversation with Naveen Kishore, she speaks of her attempt to commit suicide after she left home upon the breakup of her marriage to Bijan Bhattacharya. She says, "Do not think that I did not bleed for it. Inside, something was very empty. Moreover, my son Bappa. It seemed that I had jeopardized everything. Not that I was not a loving mother. Perhaps I don't know what created this barrier, this void inside me." And she confesses in the same interview, "I was absolutely blank with despair being separated from my son Nabarun." But she also speaks of her determination to survive. She says, and I quote, "During my second marriage, I taught myself to be alone. No one enters that solitude. No entry to everything. No sound, no chirping of birds, nothing." For Mahasweta Devi, the personal is also the political, but at a great cost. A battle between two sides of her personality, one fiercely solitary and the other passionately committed to people, relationships, and social struggles, gets played out in her life and writings. The Mahasweta we grow familiar with via her writings and via the interventions of noted critics and translators in India and abroad is a construct for public consumption, the mask the author chose to wear in order to keep from view the narrative of her personal struggles. It is time, therefore, to re examine the construct and understand it for what it is. Only then can we move forward to a fresh appraisal of Mahasweta's place in the world of letters. For much remains to be done. The vast majority of her works are still untranslated, and what I'm saying now is particularly directed at you all because you're a young audience, young researchers, young scholars. There's much that remains to be done in Mahasweta studies. The vast majority of her works are still untranslated. Translation has played a major role in her reception across India and the world, but the idea of copyright being retained by a single publisher can be troubling. There is still no definitive biography of Mahasweta. Incomplete bibliographies exist but need to be systematically updated and made widely available. A wealth of research possibilities await potential scholars in a range of disciplines: literature, language, anthropology, folklore, cultural studies, ethics, history, and sociology. Mahashata's passion for the land and for nature provides fruitful ground for new work in environmental studies. Mahashata is no more with us, but the project of getting to know her work has only just begun. Remembering Mahashata today becomes meaningful only if we avoid ritual tokenism and think collectively about avenues for future scholarship. For the legacy of Mahashata lives on through the way we remember her. I want to live forever, she once said to G.N. Devi. I will live through my writings. After my death, that's why I've asked you not to cremate me. I have no belief in being cremated and turned to ashes. I want to be somewhere. I want to be buried. What I want is for a mohua tree to be planted above me. I nurse an affection for the mohua. The tree will help me survive. She says this to Dakshin Bajrangi in Gujarat. In Mahashata's alternative vision of history, the Rani of Jhansi does not die. The vanquished queen lives on in the fantasies of the people, who swear that, and I quote, the queen hasn't died. Bhai Sahiba Zarur Jinda Honi. As long as people insist, Rani Mar Gai Na Honi, the queen did not die. The queen will be alive. This is from the Rani of Jhansi. The prophecy applies as much to the Rani of Jhansi as to her creator in this magical text. In her works and in her memories, the legend of Mahasheta Devi lives on. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Sorry, ma'am. My internet was a bit late. Um, uh,
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
um, I think uh, Africa might face some issues.
I can hear Protim.
Yeah, ma'am, am okay, 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 sure. I think will join. Actually, I think bit of connectivity issues with our part actually. Uh, just Ma'am, am I audible now?
Ma'am, am I audible now?
Ma'am, am I audible now?
Ma'am, am I
Sorry.
audible now? Sorry.
Yes,
Ma'am,
I
am
can
I
hear
audible
you.
now?
I can
Sorry,
hear
sorry,
you.
sorry.
Sorry.
I can hear you.
Sorry.
Okay.
I can hear you,
Yes.
Pratim. I can't hear Ritrika.
Okay. Actually, sorry for all the technical glitches we have. I mean, extremely sorry. But before starting off the question and answer session, there was
Pratim, I can't hear Ritrika.
sorry. Uh, I just, I mean, I'd like to show our participants about the group. Uh, Jemima, if you are there, please uh, coordinate the question and answer session for
Yes.
minutes.
Uh, Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful session. I think, Pratinda, we now can take the question answer sessions, I guess. Are you able to show me the questions that have been posted in the comment section? Okay. Uh, I think we are facing such terrible technical problems, and I'm really sorry about that. Uh, have you joined here? Okay, in the meantime, I would like to ask our participants to post their questions, queries, comments, anything that they want us to convey to Professor in the comment section on YouTube. And Shrotinda or Arachika, yeah.
Uh, yes, sorry. I mean, this is like really terrible day. But and I was just like to inform our participant about the. I mean, since ma'am was like talking about private Mahasweta and his, I mean, her life and all. So just a small piece of information for our participants that ma'am's forthcoming book is about Mahasweta Devi's Shantiniketan days. It's about reminiscence of her life, and it will be published from Seagull. And uh, as far as I know, that it will come out in December. So if you're like if you are like interested and wish to read it, please visit Sigal's official page. I wish I could show you again the book cover, which is like already in the like web platform. But I mean, due to this terrible thing, I have joined from my mobile, so I would be able. But if you are interested, do drop. I mean, do message us, do drop in, and I'll share all the information with you. And I think there is like one question in chat box, and it's like I was hoping it's like from Africa or maybe Kiku. But before beginning with that,
Yeah,
I'd like
so
to yes, yes, Jim.
yeah, I'm taking the question. Ma'am, the question is, was translating Tagore different from translating Mahasweta Devi or Bankim? How was it similar or different according to you?
Thank you for this wonderful question. Just I think in the middle of July, in a special issue of Borderless Journal, which comes out from Singapore, I was asked something like this, and I spoke there at length about how each time I translate a different writer, it's a different journey and it's a different experience. Out of these three writers, Mahasheta is the first writer I tried to translate, and it was a very difficult experience trying to capture the linguistic virtuosity of her writing and the densely layered texture and the different kinds of registers of language, how to capture those in English and in a kind of English that would work. And it was also something that was engaging with contemporary realities. So it was a world known to me, and I was entering into it through Mahasheta's language and her forms of textuality. that was another kind of experience. And then right after that, and I was translating the stories of In the Name of the Mother, which had 4 stories on motherhood. I was talking about some of them in my lecture. And alongside, I was translating 20 contemporary writers at the same time from Bangladesh and West Bengal, India, Bangladesh. 20 writers with different voices, but all contemporary, all living writers, writing about the world as I knew it. And this was at the, turn of the century, from around year 2000, 1999, 2000 onwards. But then, right after these books, the first thing I translated next was Rabindranath's Chokher Bali. And that was completely, it catapulted me into a world and a language that went 100 years back. I mean, my translation came out in 2003, but Rabindranath's novel came out in 1903, and he was already working on it in 1899 and announcing the arrival of the modern Bangla novel and the interiority of the modern Bangla novel. And he was saying all this in a path-breaking way in the same year that and here we had, Rabindranath kind of transforming the English novel and making a claim to doing so. So it was a huge jump backwards in time, and it was another kind of struggle to be able to bring that old text back to life for 21st century readers, and yet to give them the feeling that this is not a contemporary text. This is a text from another history, another ethos, and to bring that historical distance, that flavor of the archaic language, and yet to write it in modern language. The challenge I faced was different, and it involved also immersing myself in a certain history and a certain culture in order to understand that text and bring it alive. And after that, and not only after that, but I think after translating Sheshir Kavita, which was another totally different text, a much later novel than Chokher Bali, I was translating Bankim Chandra's Kapal Kundala, and I've said in my interview in Borderless that it was like it was like a backward journey in time for me, entering into Bengali literary history via translation, not reading the history of literature, chronologically, but delving further and further back and engaging with these textualities in a way that kind of drew me into the texts. And from my immersion in each individual text I was translating, I was understanding something about the deeper and deeper past of Bangla literature. And with Bankim and his highly Sanskritized language and the world he invokes in Kapal Kundala is not only, Bankim's time, it goes further back. It goes back to Mughal times. So 2 layers of history had to be captured in that translation for 21st century readers. That was, again, very, very hard. And to get the rhythms and the density of texture of Bankim's style in English, I mean, so far removed from Bankim's language. It was an experience, but again, a totally different challenge. So I think what happens when you engage with different writers, that has been my experience, is that it draws out the creativity in the translator. You realize translation is not a mechanical practice. You have to be creative, imaginative, innovative, and you are a very close reader of the text. You start living in the text. But to bring it alive, each time you have to find your own way. There's no formula. There's no dictionary that tells you how to translate Bankim differently from Tagore. The same Bangla dictionary is there. It's not going to help me. So it made me realize how creative the process of translation is.
Yeah, that's right. And some people say that translation only means that you have to listen to the author's voice. But listening to you, it makes us feel that the translator is also a creator, and she or he
Yes.
needs to make it in like their time they have to like come forward with new challenges while translating.
Yes, yes, I
Right.
think
Thank you, ma'am. And we have our next question here. Uh, what are your views on Tagore's own translation of work? As in,
so.
You have translated Tagore, and Tagore has also translated his own work. So, what are your views on them? Would you like to comment
Yes,
on that?
sure. I think that's another excellent question. And I think the reason why one translated Tagore was because there was a sense of, dissatisfaction, with the way Tagore had translated himself and the way he had been translated by several others, not because these were wrong ways of translating, but because each time the text was translated, it was approached differently by the practitioner. About Tagore's own translations, I would say that they are of widely varying qualities, and he was not always his own best translator. And sometimes his translations did him a disservice because after the initial success of Gitanjali and the text that he translated, which won him the Nobel Prize in the second decade of the 20th century. After that, the translations that came out, some were by his own hand, some were done in collaboration, some were approved by him but done by people close to him. But very often they were not really bringing his text to life in a way that they could have. And I think that affected his reputation, which began to fluctuate after that initial burst of fame. So, and Tagore himself was very diffident about his own English. He was not very confident that he would be able to translate the same way a native speaker of English could. And that diffidence shows in the way he is much less adventurous in his English translations. His use of old-fashioned language, if you look at Gitanjali, the archaisms using thee and thou, which English poets of that time had stopped using. But he was using it as if to kind of stay within the approved parameters of English usage. So while I think that it was wonderful that Tagore wrote in two languages, multiple languages actually, and that he translated from English, translated into English, but he also translated from English into Bangla. He tried translating Macbeth, the witch's scene in as a schoolboy. I mean, when he was young. So he tried translating both ways across English and Bengali, and I think that was marvelous because it shows his sensibility and his eclectic acceptance of different languages. It's less known, though, that Tagore also translated from several other Indian languages, and not just from Bangla. He translated, of course, from Sanskrit, but he translated also from he translated the poems of several medieval poets associated with the Bhakti movement. He translated Kabir, he translated Nanak, he translated Tukaram, and sometimes he didn't know the source language, but he kind of made people explain the poems to him. He worked in unorthodox collaborative ways. But if you see his volume Rupantar, it has translations of 23 poets in multiple languages, and one just looks at this kind of multilingual universe, his mental universe. It's mind boggling. And I think India today has a lesson to learn from there. So many languages coexisted in his head, and he engaged with them. I think that's what I admire, not necessarily everything that Tagore translated. Some of his translations are brilliant, but not all of them work equally well for the 21st century reader in particular, which is why I think he constantly needs to be retranslated. But I think it's fantastic how he recognized the importance of translation and engaged with it himself.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Aratrikadi, would you like to carry forward from here?
Yes, thank you, Jemima, and I apologize to ma'am earlier because I joined late and repeated your into the bio. Pratim was already introduced you before.
Not a
Also, sorry
problem.
for the technical glitches. And it
Don't
has been a
apologize,
wonderful
it's happening
session.
all the time
Yes,
to everybody.
I'll also like to, ma'am, if you allow for me some time, we can take the next question. We have a question from our student. Yes, Tulika is asking, ma'am, good evening. You have mentioned that Devi was introduced to world as she was translated in various languages. Was there any other way other than this?
To the world as she was translated. Yeah, yes, I think that's again a good question because Devi was introduced to the world, of course, through translation in a very big way. But the way there were other ways too. One was through critical interpretations because the translator is also an interpreter, and the biggest and best known example of this is Gayatri Spivak. And as I said in my lecture, she's seen as Mahasweta Devi's Dwarpalika, or the gateway to Mahasweta for Western readers. So it is her interpretation, her lens through which the Western reader is expected to receive and understand Mahasweta, and that is taken by them very often as the last word. But this is equally true of translations of Mahasweta into other languages. But she also reached the world in other ways. First of all, she reached the world herself. She was a traveler and she was a people person. She traveled across India. She met all kinds of people. She brought herself to people, right? And not all of them were able to read her work, but apart from translations, I mean, Devi herself was not someone who confined herself within the parameters of Bengal. She traveled across India. She traveled abroad. She articulated herself to various people, expressed herself to various kinds of people and audiences and circles. That's another way she was introduced. And the other form of reception we can think of and dissemination of her works is through adaptations. Look at the stage and film adaptations of Mahasweta's works. Her stories have been made into films and plays in multiple languages, and they've inspired new performances of a grassroots kind, community theatre such as Budhan Theatre. I mentioned Dakshin Bajrangi, Budhan Theatre, where people came together, and another kind of theatre outside of the formal stage and the intellectual world of theatre. Another kind of people's theatre emerged. She was also, I think, very much received in the world through her own lectures, through her activist writings in public forums. She was a journalist. Her work was coming out in newspapers. So, if you think of Mahasweta's reception, it was certainly not limited to translations alone. But since we are scholars of literature, mainly here, I imagine I was emphasizing translation, which is the way in which most of her literary output, the literary Mahasweta, traveled most of all via translation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Also, ma'am, I like to ask you something that, like, as a woman, when you are translating a woman's text or a woman writer's text, how is it different from a male translator translating Mahashta Devi's text, and how, I mean, the gaze obviously differs, the perspective differs. Maybe you can relate to her more.
I think I can't hear you very clearly, but I get your question. It's a very interesting and important question. You're asking me about my experience as a woman translator translating
Yeah.
a woman's text, and does that make a difference? I think it does. I think it does. It does because I think the way we use language can sometimes be a little different. And I think, you see, as I was saying in my lecture, translation involves, first of all, the intimacy of reading the text and immersing yourself in it. Familiarizing yourself with the source text and immersing yourself in a text where the content itself is something that speaks to you or that you can relate to or identify with creates what I call affect. Translation is not just a mechanical transfer. As I said, there is a human element in the way the translation engages with the text, just as there's a human element in the way the writer engages with the text she's writing. And at the level of affect, I feel that as a woman reader and a woman translator, if I encounter experiences that that resonate with me, it arouses a degree of emotional identification, if you like, or experiential kind of connectivity, which somewhere creates a sensitivity which is very hard to pin down in a formula and say, therefore I translate. I don't mechanically use those ways in which certain women translators abroad, for instance, the French Canadian theorists and translators who use language and pronouns differently, and who deliberately use gendered kind of language to articulate their presence, the woman translator's presence in a text. I don't necessarily do that, but somewhere I think there is a connect which shows through. And by way of contrast, let me talk about what happens when I, as a woman translator, translate a male author text, because I've translated so much of Tagore. And this is an example I've shared with other young people and other audiences, because it was for me also something that made me think. I translated Rabindranath's Chele Bala, his memoirs of his childhood, just like I've translated now Mahasweta's Our Shantiniketan. That was too a childhood memoir. I translated it several years ago. And I translated it as Boyhood Days. And foreword, the preface to my translation was written by Amartya Sen. So when he was asked to write the preface, he said, "I want to see the translation first." And when he saw the translation, he was delighted, and he said, "Very much, I definitely want to write this foreword." However, he commented in the foreword that, while he liked everything else, he felt that my understanding of the word Chelebella was somehow limited, because Chelebella in Bengali doesn't literally mean boyhood, it can mean childhood in a much broader sense. And he felt that the title was somehow limiting. And I responded to that, not there, but elsewhere. My rejoinder to that was that I was making a conscious choice, calling the text not My Childhood Days but Boyhood Days, because when I read that text, I felt that this was a boy's childhood. This was not how girls grew up in Rabindranath's time. In his own text, I felt that Rabindranath was very clear that the women around him and the girl children around him had a different upbringing. He talks about his sister going to school in a shielded palki, while he was being taught wrestling and riding and all kinds of things. And he talked about the child bride, his sister-in-law Kadambari, who came to the house at the age of 9, or was it 7? And they became playmates, and we see how circumscribed were the lives of women, and how different was the life of a boy because of the different expectations. And I said that as a woman translator, as a woman reader of the text, I feel very aware of how the text actually brings out all this in the whole ethos that it evokes. And my title was intended very deliberately to evoke that. So that's also how I work as a woman translator. That's from my own experience.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Also, ma'am, I read, I think one of in your interviews that you have said how Tagore was a very much influential figure in your, in your childhood, or at your
Yes.
home. Was the same thing with Bonkim or Mahasweta Devi, or you grew up reading them, or did you read them after you went to school or maybe college?
Uh, No, when I was that small, Mahasweta Devi was writing her early works like Rani of Jhansi and so on. And incidentally, I did not grow up in Bengal. I grew up outside Bengal. I was born in Kolkata. I had extended family and ancestral home in Kolkata, and part of my ancestry goes back to what is now Bangladesh. But I never studied Bangla formally in school or in college. And I learned Bangla at home. I was studying in an English medium school. I was speaking Hindi with everyone else and learning English and Hindi. I learned advanced Bangla at home from my very enlightened grandfather. It's the first language I learned to read and write. হাতে খড়ি হয়েছিল everything, and I was actually fluently reading and writing Bangla in the home when I joined school, and I was barely struggling to learn ABCD in English. And by the time I was in class 8, my grandfather, because he was teaching me alone, I was not in a classroom. I had no way of comparing myself to anybody. By the time I was in 8th grade in school, he had taught me MA level Bangla, and uh, and I didn't know it. I didn't know it, and I rebelled at that point. And I said, all my friends, I mean, you make me study Bangla every Sunday. They are free. They are having holidays. Every summer vacation, every winter vacation, he would make me first of all in the morning study Bangla. So I rebelled and I said, I don't want to learn Bangla anymore. And I thought it will be a very bitter battle. But he knew what he had already taught me. He said, fine, okay, fine. So that was the end of my Bangla lessons, but he gave me that gift. And later, when I was older, I understood what was the gift he had given me. So Mahasweta was not so much on my horizon at that point. She's someone I discovered through my explorations of women's writing and the comparative work with women's writing I was doing as a researcher, as a young PhD scholar. That's where it came from. And in the process of writing my dissertation, and that's another anecdote I'll share with you if you have a couple of minutes, I was doing
Yes,
my
please.
PhD from I was doing my PhD. I was trying to enroll for PhD in the University of Delhi in the English department, and I gave them a proposal where the other writers, of course, some were Indian, some were not, and it was a comparative study of women writers. The others were all writing in English, and there was a proposal that I would write a chapter on Mahasweta Devi. So there was a storm at my PhD admission interview, and everyone said this is not English, and oh, what is Mahasweta Devi doing in this project? And I said, no, but I think that, translation, English literature should also, we should think in India that English literature should include writing in English translation, writing translated into English. And, in the argument that ensued, I held my ground. And eventually they said, okay, you can, we'll allow you to write this chapter, but you will only cite material which is available in English translation. What of Mahasweta is already translated, published, available in English. You should only use that. Don't read Bangla texts and then write about them in English, because in an English project it won't do. So I said fine, and I agreed. And then during my research, I found that my interest in issues of motherhood was one strand in my research, and I found not enough translations were available of people having focused on this aspect of Mahasweta. And that's when I translated those stories myself. So I translated them, they got published, and then I cited them in my thesis. So I found, that was another way in which I engaged with Mahasweta through my research, and it inspired me to translate her work, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to cite the stories I wanted to cite. So that's another story.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing us with us. And also, like, who do you think is which text do you think is the most challenging till date among all the texts you have
Sorry,
translated?
sorry, can't hear.
Uh,
The
yeah,
most
which text
challenging text I've
most
translated,
challenging text that you have translated?
I think it's yet to come. I'm not sure. I think it's yet to come, because every time I try to translate something, it kind of, seems like the most difficult thing I've ever done, because I've not done something like it before. So, yeah, yeah. It's never easy. I've never found it easy to translate any text. But I love the struggle, it draws me in.
That's a lovely thing you've said. And any like tips for budding translators?
Sorry?
Ma'am, any tips
Sorry?
for budding translators?
Yes, I would say first of all that if you have two languages, don't waste them. Translate. This is crying need for, there's so much out there that needs to be translated and shared, not just for literary reasons, but for connectivity across different parts of the world we live in, and multicultural environment. We tend to fetishize education in one medium of education, And I think we need to break out of that as Indians. And if you have two languages, it's your, you have a treasure, you have a very special gift. I would say, value it and use it in a responsible way, but use it creatively. You know, that's what I would say.
Thank you,
It
ma'am.
can make a
And
difference. It can make a difference.
sure can. And also, if Pratim, can you unmute? Pratim can tell you about some of our translation experiences.
All right. Okay.
No, actually, I not take much time today. Like, but yes, since like I was doing my MPhil at Guwahati on Mahasweta Devi short stories, and it's about the myths, how they're like demystifying in Draupadi and all, and like how Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi is getting translated and like sort of reinterpreted in Assamese. So it was like really fascinating, and I remember when I mean 1 week back, ma'am proposed us to talk about Monster Devi. Like it was like really, I mean, happy moment for me to hear
That's nice.
about Monster Devi and I mean her works from ma'am. But yes, I mean, translating Mahasweta and like her works have like there are sort of like many arguments and everything, and like since I mean the Spivaks introduced this subaltern thing, also like it sort of dismantle the space, and there's like various like arguments about it. But during my MPhil, since I was working on the meats and how he reinterpret meat in Draupadi on the optimization, so it was like really interesting that how she sort of like giving an identity to a subaltern woman and establishing her character in association with the stories from the meat and how she's borrowing. And the similar thing after I mean her writing, it was like I was like seeing multiple text in Assamese, which is like since like I used to read SMS a little bit, I found almost 30 to 32 short stories and as well as 10 and 5, yes, approx 10 poems, which sort of recreated Mahasweta Devi's this story, and they sort of I mean, selected this Draupadi icon and sort of took inspiration from Mahasweta Devi's path, and they translated it Assamese. So it was like really and path breaking and really interesting when we are like sort of researching on the receptions of Mahasweta and how she's celebrated across the nation and to the world. So this was like really fascinating. And but yes, the another thing I would like to hear. Yes, I mean this meat thing, the subaltern thing. We all, I mean, almost everyone in this academia know about it. But the point actually I really liked about today's lecture is the private life of Mahasweta and how ma'am is like sort of sheds lights on it. And this is like the area sort of which is like not very much discussed, and this sort I mean this is the sort of information we also need to hear, or probably like came into the like into the area of research and everything. So that's it, and I would like to, I mean, again, thank you, ma'am, on behalf of our entire team for joining us today. And if Jamima and Aratika have anything to add, you may go forward. Otherwise, we can formally end this session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratim. Before ending the session, just want to ask, ma'am, if you have any plans, on translating any different authors in the upcoming future. Any other women writers?
At present, actually, I'm doing something very different. I'm translating the essays of Nojrul Islam.
Okay,
And
that is amazing, ma'am.
yes, because his poetry is so well known. It's such powerful prose.
Yes.
So again, I'm doing something. I've moved away, and I'm doing something very different. I'm also working with some Tagore translations. But yes, you're asking if I'm translating any woman. Chandravati Ramayan is of great fascination to me, and off and on, for the last 2 3 years, I've been picking up passages and translating those. I don't know whether I will work with the whole text or not, but I keep going back to it. It keeps drawing me, and it's again very challenging. It's a medieval text. So as I said, my translations keep taking me further and further back in time into Bengali literary history. So yes, a woman I'm connecting with who is not our contemporary but is remarkably modern in the approach she takes is Chandravati.
It is an extremely very powerful text also. It's an amazing
Yes,
text.
it's important
Yes, ma'am.
text. Important
It's very
text.
important. Please do the whole translation. We'll love to read
Let's
it
see.
someday.
Let's see. I need several lifetimes, as I said, translate all the things I feel like translating. But you all should take up things yourselves.
Thank you, ma'am. We have started, like I have done some, Pratim has done some. We have translated some Dalit writings from Hindi to English and
Very
from
good. Excellent.
Hindi to Bangla. We have done some. We are also hoping for translation furthermore to
Wonderful.
other languages as
Congratulations.
well.
Very
Thank you,
important
ma'am.
work you're doing. Keep
Thank
on.
you,
Don't
ma'am.
give up. Keep on. Yeah.
Mm, thank you
It
so
will be of
much.
great value to the world. Yes, thank you. So I'll wish you all the best and thank
Thank
you
you
very
so
much
much, ma'am.
for inviting me to your forum. I really enjoyed my interaction and I think you're doing a marvelous series of lectures. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
And Jemima, if you would like to give the vote of thanks and formally end this today's lecture.
On behalf of Calcutta Comparatists 1919 and its members, I would like to convey our hearty thanks to Professor Radha Chakravarty. A big thank you to you, ma'am, for sharing your ideas and views with us. I would like to express our gratitude to you for responding to us and coming to our forum. We are really inspired by your great words. Thank you to all our audience on YouTube for being with us today. Here we officially conclude this session. Stay tuned for our upcoming events on this channel. Thank you. And good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank you.
everyone. Good
Good
night, ma'am.
night. Bye bye.
Bye, ma'am.